Well, it's been 15 months now since Russia invaded Ukraine, and we have on BizNews had a interview with the Russian spokesman. It was quite a strange one, but you can go and get that into the archives. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Ambassador Luibov Abravitova, who is the Ukraine ambassador for South Africa, Botswana, and Mozambique. Ambassador, it was interesting to see, given that your country is at war, that you in fact come from a military background.
Not really. My father is military, so I raised in the family with strong discipline and probably understanding of what real military dignified man means.
It is interesting to us sitting here far away from all the action to have witnessed 15 months ago a war that was supposed to not even last 15 days. Was it a surprise that the Russians actually did invade Ukraine, as much of a surprise within the country as it appears to have been to most people elsewhere in the world?
I think that it was a surprise for the world, but it was not a surprise for Ukraine. We were alerting everyone in the world, including South Africa, that the military build-up was happening since December 2021, that 200,000 military men around our borders, it's quite an expensive exercise just to be military drills. But let me remind you that we already were in war. That war started in 2014. And we definitely knew from the previous invasions of Russia and frozen conflicts that they made, particularly in Georgia in 2008, that would not stop them, as well as we do understand that if we don't stop them today, they will continue doing so. That's why we say that we are fighting today not only for our existence, not only for our sovereignty and territorial integrity, we're fighting for all of you. They declared 3-day operation. They were coming to Ukraine, having in the back of their troops the solemn outfits to celebrate their victory and having parade in Kiev, which never happened, as we know. And yes, it was for them a big surprise as well, as for many countries of the world.
Ambassador, how much of a democracy is Ukraine? Often one gets fake news and gets all kinds of people giving us information that the Russians were justified in invading. How do you answer those criticisms?
I love to answer this question because every day the answer is more profound and very obvious. Since 2014, we were showing to the world and proving that democracy in Ukraine is not the empty sound, that people have their voice and that they have a right to raise this voice. We have been going through a series of different reforms internally. Why? Ironically, because of our aspiration to become EU and NATO members. Because in order to become members of these organizations or alliances, you have to meet certain standards. And it's not only about the standards of democracy, it's about corruption, and it was a big issue for Ukraine. So we still have been going through those reforms. Why I'm saying I like to answer this question because a big modified story about justification of Russian invasion was the Nazism story in Ukraine. So for our and your audience, esteemed audience, understanding, Ukraine has a huge number of different political parties. If I'm not mistaken, more than 300. Obviously, not all of them are able to reach that volume that they can become the members of our parliament, which called Verkhovna Rada. So we assume that you have different kind of parties, left and right, liberal and conservative, but you'll never find in our history when we would have the far right or right party in our parliament. And that would be my answer to the predictable question that you would raise.
How do you then handle diplomacy in South Africa, given that South Africa is a democracy, Ukraine is a democracy? No democracy has ever invaded another democracy in history. It's a fact. And you have been invaded, and yet South Africa seems to be aligning with the autocracy that invaded this democracy. I hope that's not too much of a tongue twister, but I'm trying to get to yourself as a diplomat. How do you deal with this strange situation?
Is that much complicated as it is easy? And the answer is in your question. Both countries are democracies. Moreover, we are democracies of approximately the same age. Ukraine regained its independence in 1991, and that's when we started to build our democracy. Same thing with you, 1994. It's not an empty sound that we have long standing relations between Ukraine and South Africa. Ukraine was a very crucial part of the anti-apartheid struggle of South Africa. A lot of ANC leaders, ANC veterans were supported, raised, taken care, and trained in Odessa and in Crimea, which, as you know, is Ukraine. So we are today fighting exactly for the same values that South Africa was fighting at that time. And basically, we are fighting for our freedom. And the meaning of freedom is something that you cannot be not aligned to, as well as you cannot be not aligned with United Nations Charter or to the international law. I'm bringing you closer to the next anticipated question, but indeed, it is a very unique situation when the country, independent democratic country, being invaded and the open scale invasion is happening. It's not only about the military damage that is causing in the occupied areas. It's about violation of sovereignty, of territorial integrity. It's about killing civilian people. It's about one autocracy ordering to its soldiers to kill and rape women and children when documented atrocities, documented rape is from 4-year-old to 84-year-old. And when you have to talk in this country about this diplomatically and to bring to the attention that these violations of all possible norms of international law, of humanitarian and human rights, of humanitarian law and human rights, of UN Charter, is something that if today would be allowed in Ukraine, it will come as a boomerang to many countries in Africa. And diplomacy is about dialogue. It's about building bridge, or even finding yourself in very complicated dialogues to keep the bridge of communication and to express clearly and profoundly the positions and the reasons for these positions. And that's what we have been doing, as you correctly mentioned, for 15 months so far.
What did you make of the arms to Russia scandal as we are seeing it here in South Africa? The Lady R, the US ambassador's allegations that South Africa has been supplying arms to Russia, to your invaders.
I would allow myself on this issue to stay diplomatic and to tell you that we do see the news, but we also acknowledge that President Ramaphosa appointed the independent investigation, and we're looking forward for the results of this investigation. And as soon as it comes out, we will be able to react and to discuss. Yet, it is on the level of intelligences and other investigative groups to deal with that. We don't have this type of information available at the embassy. So we are very much.
But when it was first raised 6 months ago, what was the reaction like in Kiev? When it was first raised that this Russian boat had docked in South Africa under the cover of night, that there had been allegedly arms and ammunitions put onto it. Right at that stage, 6 months ago, what did your colleagues in Kiev say to you to react? Because surely there would be something that you should have.
No, everyone
said.
is reading news. It's obviously, and Ukrainian side also reading South African news. It was made very known, and there was a lot of questions and debates as well. So what usually the ambassador in my capacity does, you're requesting the meeting with the appropriate ministry, which is the Ministry of Defense and Veterans in your country. And I'm looking forward still to meet with the minister and discuss this issue to that extent as we, as the minister and the ambassador, can.
So you have not met with them yet?
Not yet.
And then the other big controversy that's going around in South Africa at the moment is the issuing of diplomatic immunity to President Putin, who will be visiting here perhaps in August. From your perspective, from Ukraine's perspective, what do you make of this?
There are separate tracks here. So the foreign or summit that is happening, or any other summit that will be happening in the future, will assume that South Africa will provide diplomatic immunities to the attendees. We have a very unique situation where an international criminal court issued the lifelong warrant to arrest Putin, not just for nothing, for documented and provable facts, for actually what we call a genocide against Ukraine, when you are deliberately taking Ukrainian children from the occupied territories and taking them in the unknown direction in Russia, and keeping that in total secrecy. And this fact documented, then this is real genocide, isn't it? This is how you eliminate the independent sovereign state and nation. You are just stealing children. And that's why the warrant was issued. And South Africa finds itself in a position when it is signatory to the Rome Statute. And according to this, under this, it has certain obligations. This is the issue to the international lawyers to give a clear explanation when and how the internal law can prevail over international law. But it seems to me that the fact of announcing immunities to all the participants is not unwilling or removing the obligation that exists according to international law. That's why it is so much and so broadly discussed, and it is a big conundrum.
Ambassador, what does Ukraine make of South Africa's public position of non-alignment in this war? Do you believe it?
I believe that you cannot be non-aligned with UN Charter, with values of freedom and democracy. I want to make it very clear for our viewers that it's not kind of Western values or Eastern or global South values. These are the values that firmly connect us, Ukraine and South Africa, and I hope the rest of democratic world. The position of neutrality that is taken, call it non-alignment position, is something that we respect because we are not intervening into the neither internal nor external policy of South Africa to make own choice. This is something that Ukraine is fighting. There isn't. But what we would want to see, definitely, and why we are continuing this dialogue and working on different levels with South Africa and many other countries who didn't take stance on invasion, on violations, as to explain and to open the doors of further engagement on how we are going to live in this world when one country is allowed silently to invade another country. I think that a lot of smaller countries, particularly in Africa, might be disturbed about such a silence of bigger countries that are allowed to do so. So the precedent should be making, would be a disaster. That's why Ukrainian fight and struggle today is so important for everyone, particularly for the countries that yet didn't take stand. And I really do believe that this is just a matter of time.
From the reports, you keeping very close to what is happening at home, one of the issues that bothers or matters to us in Africa is the role being played by the mercenary Wagner organization. Are you aware of what they're actually up to in Africa? The reports we have is they're not just operating in Bakhmut in your country, but in numerous African countries where they are pretty active.
I would say that this is the issue that we might want to discuss even in the separate interview because it is very broad and it touches different places in the world and different countries in Africa. I'm not responsible for all Africa. I'm covering only the region within 10 countries of Southern African region. We do understand that this organization needs a very careful attention and research by African researchers, and that the main goal of this organization is to get resources out of Africa in order to finance the military sector, but also to take those resources not just for free, but by bringing into some African countries conflicts. And I will stop on this.
And just to close off with, could you give us an update on the spring offensive and how the war is going from the Ukrainian perspective?
What's called in South Africa spring offensive, we call the autumn offensive, because our counteroffensive started in September last year. Up to this time, we were able to regain half of occupied territories. I know that it's a big talk now about our bigger counteroffensive that, trust me, will happen, and we are getting ready for that. Because we will not stop unless we are achieving back our land in internationally recognized borders of 1991. It is very maybe, it looks that it's very easy to pronounce, but behind these words, we see lives that lost, we see a lot of damage, we see people who are disabled, we see a lot of civilians killed, we see people displaced internally and externally, we see people that are killed from another side. As of today, more than 200,000 Russians were killed in Ukraine, and all of them have their families, wives, sisters, mothers. The war is bad, and Ukrainians are those ones who don't want this war. Important to note, to mention that Ukraine is fighting back on our own territory. We are not fighting in Russia. We are fighting in Ukraine against the invader who occupied our areas, our territories, and who wants more. It's not about the propaganda of Russia when they were saying that this is to protect Russians in Donbass. When you go to protect someone in Donbass, you are not going and killing civilians in Kiev. And this is how invasion started, the pre-day operation. So the situation is very tough because the enemy is desperate. All the justifications of invasion are unreal, even in front of those countries that are still positioned themselves as friends of Russia. It is further harder and harder to justify all those atrocities. Now, more and more leaders are coming and verifying on their own eyes, seeing the truth. And for Russia, the war ideologically is lost already a long time ago. And now to be embarrassed to the extent that the world see that world's largest army, the biggest army, is not a biggest army, it's just a long army. I think that we definitely see that the enemy is desperate, and unfortunately, it is reflected in more massive and diabolic attacks on the peaceful cities. What has been happening for last 10 days, because we have families, we have friends there in Ukraine, when you are not sleeping together with them, because as soon as they're going to sleep at night, the enemy sends missiles and rockets on the multi-story buildings with sleeping people and children. People are hiding in shelters. Some of them are already so tired, they're not going to shelters. We call it the rule of two walls. If you're protected by two walls and even the missile goes in, at least you will survive. That's what they believe. So children are sleeping in bathrooms, parents are sleeping in corridors of their apartments, and that's the reality of all Ukrainians say every night. So people say that, of course, they're just tired. And this is what enemy wants to achieve, but the enemy doesn't know you. And Ukrainians are not Russian. We did prove it. More we are living through this, more resistant we are. People continue to say and say it more and more that we'll overcome.
Ambassador, where does it all end?
For us, it ends when we remove Russians if they don't remove themselves from our territory. When we just give back our land. And then Russia will need to go away. But it's not the end for Ukraine because we want security guarantees. We cannot live with this country on our border, which we will. You cannot legally change your borders and change three things in your life. It's motherland, parents, and your neighbors. So neighbors will stay, but these neighbors are not just became hostile in 2014. We have a long history where Russia was trying to eliminate us as the nation, not to allow us to develop our culture and language. In 20th century, in the beginning, we paid the lives of millions of Ukrainians during Holodomor, which is great famine in Ukraine, when Stalin ordered to remove any possible food from Ukrainians, any seed. People in millions were dying. The reason for that was just our determination to be independent and to have our self-identity. This is the facts that are proven. Ukrainian archives being opened. Russia didn't open their archives. The Russian population, which is supporting Putin and his propaganda and his unprovoked war, they raised on inexistent history and the history of life. That's why I'm coming back. Security guarantees are crucial. This will be the end when Russia will understand that Ukraine has these guarantees. For us, today is NATO. We can discuss it separately. This is the alliance that already exists, that we were aiming into, and which aspiration to become a member is in our constitution for a long time already. So the security guarantees can be broader than NATO, and we would welcome as many countries as possible to provide us with those guarantees. Why I'm making accent on security guarantees? Very simple. We are sharing the same story with South Africa. We abandoned our nuclear weapons, you and us, but we abandoned third largest nuclear weapon in the world. And we did it under security guarantees that were provided by Russian Federation, Great Britain, and the United States. Now, one of these countries who guaranteed our territorial integrity and sovereignty is invading us and attacking us since 2014. So this setup of security arrangements didn't work. And by the way, why we are calling on particularly on Great Britain and United States and counting on them, which used by Russian propaganda, but simply because they have obligation. We are not asking them for weapons. We are demanding weapons because they provided us with guarantees. Now we are under.
Ambassador Luibov Abravitova, the ambassador to South Africa of Ukraine, thank you for sharing your insights with us today. We look forward to our next conversation on the Wagner Group and more, I'm sure. And I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.